Today's story is unlike any you've heard before. It is a haunting account, whispered in the shadows of forgotten childhood memories, that reveals the darker side of seemingly innocent moments. Imagine yourself as a young child, exploring the familiar corners of your neighborhood, where everything feels safe and every stranger holds a smile. You're at that age when life is simple, and the world seems like a storybook that promises nothing but adventure and joy. Now imagine that illusion shattering in a single, unforgettable moment, a moment that injects fear and terror into the innocent fabric of your childhood. This story takes us back to the days when I used to visit an elderly couple at the end of my street. They were kind, generous, and always welcoming. Their gate left unlatched so that I could come and go as I pleased to play with their ducks and turtles. There was something almost magical about that place. A garden filled with lively quacks and the gentle splashing of turtles moving through a small pond. But beneath that friendly facade lay a dark secret, one that would come to haunt my waking and sleeping moments. It was a cloudy afternoon, the kind of day where shadows stretch longer and everything seems to move in slow motion, burdened by an unseen weight. I remember the air, thick, heavy, and almost stifling. As I approached their gate, I felt a chill running down my spine, an inexplicable sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite place. The garden was silent, too silent. The usual chatter of the ducks and the rustling of the old man working among his plants was absent. It felt as though the world had paused, and I was stepping into a space between reality and something far more sinister. I opened the gate, its rusted hinges groaning louder than ever before, as if protesting against my entrance. The air seemed colder the moment I stepped inside, and an uncomfortable sensation swept over me, a sense that something unseen was watching me from the shadows, unseen eyes following my every move. Each step toward the backyard felt heavier than the last, like wading through an invisible fog that clung to my skin, whispering a warning I was too young to fully comprehend. And then I saw it, the image that is burned into my memory, sharp and vivid even today, the old man, hanging from a tree in the middle of the garden. His face was twisted in an expression I couldn't understand back then, anguish, pain, perhaps regret. His body swayed slightly with the breeze, casting an eerie dance of shadows across the garden. The branch creaked, each sound like a scream echoing in the deafening silence of that yard. My eyes widened, heart pounding with a terror I had never felt before. It was as if the world had turned inside out, every comforting aspect of my life suddenly replaced by horror. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, my mind desperately trying to find another explanation, anything but the truth that was staring me in the face. I wanted to believe it was a trick, a mannequin, a figment of my imagination brought on by the gloomy weather. But it wasn't. It was real, and the longer I stared, the more I felt the cold fingers of fear wrap around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter. That's when I heard it, a sound that to this day I cannot forget, a whisper, so faint that it could have been the wind or a trick of my panicked mind. But it sounded like my name, carried through the air from somewhere close, yet impossibly distant. It sent a shiver from the base of my skull to the tips of my fingers. I ran. I turned on my heel, stumbling through the garden, heart thundering, breath coming in ragged gasps as though the very air had turned against me, thick and suffocating. I ran from that place, from the sight of the old man, from the whispers that followed me, and from the feeling that I was no longer alone, that something dark had attached itself to me. Before we continue, if you're captivated by this chilling tale, if the suspense has you on edge, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share it with those who are brave enough to confront the darkest aspects of our reality. Because this story is just beginning, and what happens next will make you question what truly waits in the shadows of your own memories. The elderly couple's house stood at the far end of a street that seemed to be swallowed by the dense, ancient forest behind it. It was the kind of place that, in daylight, looked idyllic, a patch of bright, colorful life amid the encroaching wilderness. The garden was filled with flowers that bloomed in every color. Ducks waddled about with a lazy grace, and turtles basked on the edges of a small, murky pond. To a child, it was like a scene straight out of a fairy tale. But that particular day was different. The sun hid behind thick, oppressive clouds, casting everything in muted grays, making the garden look like a ghost of itself, lifeless, empty. The gate to their backyard was made of iron, covered in vines that had grown unchecked for years, almost as if nature had tried to reclaim it. On that day, the gate felt more like a boundary between two worlds, the ordinary street behind me and the strange, disquieting atmosphere that lay beyond its threshold. As I pushed it open, the hinges let out a metallic groan, a sound so shrill it seemed to cut through the quiet, like a warning that I was about to cross into forbidden territory. I ignored the chill creeping up my spine. I had come here many times before, after all, but something felt different. The air was heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. There was no sign of the elderly couple. Usually, the old man would be out there tending to his garden, his gentle humming blending in with the natural chorus of quacking ducks and the splash of the turtles. But today, all of that was gone. No humming, no chatter. Just an eerie silence that seemed to press against my ears, amplifying every small noise I made. My footsteps felt too loud, echoing strangely against the muted surroundings, and the rustle of leaves sounded almost like whispers, like voices hiding just beyond my understanding. The garden, once a vibrant sanctuary, now felt almost menacing. The flowers seemed to droop, their colors dull and faded. The pond, which usually rippled with life, lay still as a mirror, reflecting the looming branches above it in an unnatural stillness. The air smelled different, too, like damp earth, but mixed with something metallic, something that made my stomach twist in unease. I could feel the cold creeping in, settling into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as if the warmth had been drained from this place, replaced by an unseen presence watching from the shadows. I continued walking, each step feeling like a journey deeper into a place I no longer recognized. The large oak tree in the middle of the garden, with its gnarled branches stretching skyward, had always been a place of comfort, a spot where I would sit under its shade, watching the ducks with the elderly man who lived there. But that day, the tree looked different, darker, as if its branches were reaching not for the sky but for me, trying to ensnare me, to pull me closer to whatever horror was lurking beneath its bark. I paused, staring up at the tree, my gaze tracing the lines of its branches. There was something there, something hanging, swaying slightly in the dim light, a shadow that didn't belong among the leaves. My heart began to pound, a slow, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo in the silence around me. I stepped closer, curiosity mingling with fear, the instinct to run battling with the need to understand what was wrong. That's when I saw him, the old man, suspended by a thick rope, his body swaying gently as if in time with some sinister, invisible breeze. The world seemed to shift in that moment. The colors around me drained, leaving everything in shades of gray and black. The cold became unbearable, like icy fingers pressing down on my skin. My throat tightened, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, like the very atmosphere was conspiring against me, refusing to let me voice my terror. My eyes were locked on him, on his lifeless form, the features of his face contorted in a way that no child should ever have to see. The tree that had once been a place of safety now stood as a monument to death, casting its long, dark shadow over the garden, over me, and over the innocence that I lost in that single moment. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye, a flicker in the corner of my vision. I snapped my head to the side, and for just a second, I saw her, the old woman, standing near the edge of the garden, her face pale, her eyes wide, staring straight at me. Her lips moved, as if she was trying to say something, but the words never reached me. And then she was gone, fading into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of her presence. My heart pounded faster, and I could feel the panic rising, a deep, primal terror that demanded I flee, that I get away from whatever this was, away from the inexplicable, the unknown. The garden that had once been filled with laughter and warmth had turned into a nightmare, a place where the dead lingered, where shadows moved without cause, and where even the trees seemed to whisper secrets too dark for the living. The boundary between life and death had blurred, and I, a child with no understanding of such horrors, had crossed into a world where innocence offered no protection, where the darkness watched and waited, and where the only thing I could do was run before it consumed me entirely. The first signs that something was terribly wrong came subtly, creeping into my awareness like a chill that had no source. As I stood there, trying to shake off the image of the old man hanging from the tree, I felt the air shift. It wasn't a sudden change, but rather a creeping sensation, an oppressive heaviness that seemed to grow thicker with each breath I took. The wind, which had been gentle moments before, died down, leaving an eerie stillness. It was as though the entire garden had paused, every leaf frozen in place, every blade of grass silenced. It was an unnatural kind of quiet, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes your instincts scream that something isn't right. Then, the temperature began to drop. The warmth of the afternoon sun, already faint behind thick clouds, seemed to vanish altogether. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled over me, like icy fingers pressing down on my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. It was as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the world, leaving nothing but an emptiness that made me shiver. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to fight off the chill, but it clung to me like a second skin, refusing to let go. A sudden noise broke the silence, a soft rustling, just beyond the garden's edge, where the dense forest began. My eyes snapped toward the sound, my heart thudding in my chest. The noise was faint, almost like the gentle brushing of leaves, but there was something deliberate about it, something that didn't belong to the rhythm of nature. It was as if someone or something was moving just out of sight, watching me, waiting. I scanned the tree-line, searching for the source, but saw nothing. Just shadows, deep and impenetrable, that seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I looked directly at them. The whispering began soon after. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind or the rustling leaves, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a low, almost inaudible murmur, like a voice carried from far away. I couldn't make out any words, but there was an urgency to it, a sense of desperation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned my head, trying to pinpoint the source, but the whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding me, filling the empty spaces of the garden. It felt like the very air was alive, moving with an unseen presence that was growing closer. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable. It wasn't just the feeling of eyes on me. It was something deeper, more invasive, like an unseen force was pressing into my mind, trying to pull me toward the darkness at the edge of the garden. I took a step back, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The ducks and turtles that had once filled this place with life were nowhere to be seen, as if they too had sensed the unnatural shift and fled. I was alone, and the garden, once a place of innocent play, now felt like a trap, a place that had lured me in with familiarity only to reveal the horror lurking beneath. I turned to leave, to run back through the gate and away from the creeping terror, but then I heard it. A creaking sound, slow and deliberate, like the groaning of an old door being opened, or the rope tied to the branch shifting under weight. My head whipped around, my eyes landing on the tree, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The old man's body, which had been still, now moved slightly, swaying as if touched by an unseen hand. His head lolled to the side, his lifeless eyes seeming to fix on me, staring with an intensity that was impossible for something dead. Panic surged through me. My legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground, but the fear was stronger, pushing me to move, to get away from those empty, staring eyes. I took a shaky step backward, and then another, my gaze locked on the body as it swayed, as though nodding to some terrible secret only it knew. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to chant just beneath the level of understanding, filling the garden with their haunting, unintelligible song. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, closing the distance between me and whatever nightmare had taken hold of this place. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tight with fear. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my ears, drowning out the whispering that filled the garden. The gate was just a few steps away, but it felt like miles, like an impossible distance that I would never reach. The garden, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed to twist and distort around me, the shadows lengthening, the branches above creaking like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The old man's body swayed again, and I could almost swear I saw his lips move, forming words that I would not understand. I turned and ran, the cold biting at my skin, the whispers following me, echoing in my ears as I fled. The gate was heavy, resisting as I pulled it open, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it, that the garden, the darkness, the thing that whispered my name would drag me back. But the gate gave way, and I stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. The whispers stopped, cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. The street beyond the gate was quiet, normal, but I knew that what I had experienced was real, that the garden, the house, held something dark, something that had awakened that day, and I had barely escaped its grasp. The days that followed that chilling afternoon were a blur of fear and confusion. I was just a child, and the images of what I had seen refused to fade, haunting my dreams and creeping into my waking moments. The face of the old man, twisted and lifeless, lingered in my mind, and with it came the whispers, faint and echoing, as if they were just out of reach. I tried to avoid thinking about it, tried to stay away from that end of the street, but something inside me felt drawn to that house, like a dark magnet that pulled me toward it despite the fear. It was an urge I couldn't shake, the need to understand, to know why I felt that presence still clinging to me, shadowing my every step. My mother told me that the couple had died, her voice careful, her eyes filled with worry. She tried to reassure me that everything was fine now, that they were gone, and that I should forget about it. But I couldn't. I felt as though a part of me had been left behind in that garden, tethered to the old oak tree where I had seen the old man hanging. The whispers hadn't stopped. Every time I found myself alone, in the quiet moments before sleep, or when the mist settled thick over our street, I heard them, calling to me, drawing me back to that place. I faced a choice: ignore it, pretend that everything was normal, or return to that garden and confront whatever darkness had taken root there. The thought of going back filled me with dread, a deep, visceral fear that twisted in my gut and made my hands shake. But the idea of ignoring it was even worse. The presence wouldn't let me go. The whispers would never stop, and I knew that I had to find out what it wanted. Even if it meant facing the terror head-on, I couldn't live with that darkness hovering over me, watching from the shadows. One late afternoon, the air thick with mist, and the sky an oppressive gray, I made my decision. My heart pounded with every step as I walked down the street, my feet moving almost on their own accord, carrying me toward the old couple's house. The street seemed longer than before, the houses more distant, and the mist seemed to wrap around me, isolating me from the rest of the world. By the time I reached the gate, my breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The gate was still there, its iron vines twisting like skeletal fingers, and as I pushed it open, the hinge let out that same metallic groan, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet of the mist-filled afternoon. Stepping into the garden was like stepping into another world, a place caught between the living and the dead. The cold hit me immediately, the air thick with the same unnatural chill that had settled over the garden on that first day. The flowers were wilted, their once bright colors reduced to dull, decaying shades, and the pond lay still, its surface reflecting the twisted branches above. I swallowed hard, my eyes drawn inexorably toward the oak tree in the center of the garden. It loomed over me, dark and menacing, its branches stretching out like gnarled arms reaching for something just beyond my sight. I took a step closer, my legs heavy, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't. I had come here for a reason, to face whatever haunted this place, and end it once and for all. As I approached the tree, I felt the presence again, that same oppressive feeling, as though unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. The whispers started, soft at first, barely more than a rustle in the air. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me, growing louder with every heartbeat. My name, over and over, whispered by voices I didn't recognize, voices that seemed to echo with a strange, otherworldly quality. My eyes were fixed on the tree, on the branch where the rope had hung. I could almost see it, swaying gently in the cold breeze, the old man's body dangling lifelessly. The whispers grew louder, insistent, like a chorus demanding my attention. My knees felt weak, and for a moment, I thought I would collapse, the weight of the fear pressing down on me, suffocating me. But then I saw it, something at the base of the tree, half hidden among the roots. It was a small, glinting object, barely visible in the fading light. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was an old locket, its surface tarnished, the chain broken. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, and as I did, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that seemed to press against my ears, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew, without understanding why, that this locket was important, that it was connected to whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves, and I looked up, my eyes widening as I saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden, the old woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, and her mouth moved silently, as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. My heart pounded in my chest, fear gripping me, but I couldn't look away. She raised her hand, pointing toward a locket in my hand, her eyes locking onto mine. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, fading into the mist, leaving me alone in the cold, silent garden. I stood, the locket clutched tightly in my hand, my mind racing. I knew that this was far from over, that the darkness in this place was still there, watching, waiting. But I also knew that I had taken the first step toward understanding it, toward facing it. The whispers had stopped, and for the first time since that terrible day, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could end this, that I could free myself from the shadows that had haunted me for so long. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reach out once more. The decision to return had been difficult, but the confrontation that awaited was far beyond anything my imagination could have conjured. It was a late afternoon, the sun struggling to break through the thick layers of clouds that hung low in the sky, giving everything an eerie, muted glow. I returned to the garden, the weight of the locket heavy in my pocket, and as I crossed the threshold of the rusted gate, the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, and every sound felt muffled, as though the world beyond the garden had ceased to exist. The silence of the place was deafening. Not a single bird called, not a breeze stirred the leaves, and even my footsteps seemed swallowed by the thick, oppressive quiet. I stepped closer to the old oak tree, my eyes fixed on the branch where I had once seen the old man. The memory of that image still haunted me, his lifeless form swaying gently, his eyes empty. The garden had become a place of decay. The flowers, now wilted and withered, stood as remnants of a once colorful world now turned gray and lifeless. The ducks had never returned, nor had the turtles. It was as if life itself had abandoned this place. I stood before the tree, my breath visible in the chilling air, and pulled the locket from my pocket. The metal felt colder than the air around it, almost unnaturally so, and as I held it in my hand, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. It was like something was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the shadowy corners of the garden, but there was nothing, just the mist and the silent, skeletal branches above me. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, a sound so faint it could have been my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was the same sound I had heard before, the whispering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. My skin prickled, a shiver running down my spine, and I turned slowly, the locket clutched tightly in my fist. There, just beyond the pond, I saw a shadow, a figure, barely discernible through the mist, but unmistakable in its form. It was the old woman, her face still pale, her eyes wide and hollow. She stood there, unmoving, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The air around me seemed to grow colder still, the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to breathe. I took a step back, my foot crunching on the dead leaves beneath me, and the figure moved slowly, almost gliding toward me. I could see her face more clearly now, her expression twisted into something that looked like both sorrow and rage, her eyes locking onto mine. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my head, filling my mind with a noise that drowned out every rational thought. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to turn, to flee from this nightmare, to leave that garden behind and never return. But something held me in place, a force that seemed to root me to the ground, refusing to let me move. The figure drew closer, her eyes never leaving mine, and I felt a chill seep into my bones, a cold that seemed to come from within, spreading through me like ice. I raised the locket, my hand trembling, and her gaze shifted to it. For a moment, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. Her lips moved, forming words that I could barely hear, but I understood them. "Give it back." Her voice was faint, like a breath carried on the wind, but it was filled with a desperation that struck me to my core. I looked down at the locket, its surface dull in the fading light, and something clicked in my mind, an understanding that this small object was the key, that it was the reason she was here, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. My heart pounded, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I stepped closer to the tree, the locket held out in front of me. The figure stopped, her eyes watching me, and I could see a change in her expression, a flicker of hope, of something that almost looked like peace. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough bark of the oak tree, and placed the locket at its base, pressing it into the earth beneath the twisted roots. The whispers grew louder for a moment, a final crescendo that seemed to shake the very air around me, and then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The silence that followed was deep, profound, and the figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist, her eyes still fixed on mine, but now filled with something other than anger. Relief. The cold began to lift, the weight that had pressed down on me easing, and I watched as the mist seemed to swallow her, leaving nothing but the quiet, empty garden behind. I took a step back, my knees weak, my entire body trembling with the adrenaline that coursed through me. The garden looked different now, still decayed, still filled with shadows, but the presence that had haunted it, that had haunted me, was gone. I could feel it, the difference in the air, the absence of the darkness that had lingered for so long. I turned and walked back to the gate, my steps slow, my heart still pounding, but the fear that had gripped me was beginning to fade. I had faced the darkness, had confronted the supernatural force that had haunted my memories, and somehow I had survived. As I stepped through the gate, closing it behind me, I felt a strange sense of closure, a sense that perhaps, finally, I could leave that terrible day behind me. But as I looked back at the house, at the garden's shrouded mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched from the shadows, that the line between our world and theirs was thinner than I had ever imagined, and that, perhaps, it was not yet the end. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent pressure that seemed to weigh down on every part of me as I stood in that garden, feeling that I had stepped into the very heart of the unknown. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them echoed in my mind, and I knew that whatever had haunted this place had not completely vanished. There was still something left, something unresolved, and it called to me from the darkness that clung to the garden like a veil. I could feel it, a presence that still watched from the shadows, still held sway over the decaying flowers and still pond. I was drawn back to the oak tree, the place where the old man had ended his life, the place where I had seen the old woman's spirit lingering, her face twisted in anguish. My gaze fell on the locket, now resting at the base of the tree, partially buried among the roots. It seemed so small, so insignificant, and yet it held a power over this place that I couldn't fully understand. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the cold metal once more, and as I did, I felt something shift in the air, a sudden, unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The world around me seemed to dim, the colors fading until everything was cloaked in shades of gray. My breath hitched in my throat, a chill running through me, and I looked up to see the mist thickening, swirling around the garden in unnatural patterns. It was as though the very air had come alive, moving with a purpose that I couldn't grasp. Shadows stretched and twisted, shapes forming at the edges of my vision, shifting just beyond my ability to focus on them. The atmosphere felt charged, like a storm was brewing, the kind of tension that made my skin prickle and my heart pound. And then, from the depths of the mist, I saw her again. The old woman, her figure barely visible, like a silhouette carved from smoke, standing near the oak tree. Her eyes, hollow and dark, locked onto mine, and her mouth opened, the words she tried to speak nothing more than a breathless rasp. I strained to hear her, my entire body frozen in place, and as her form became clearer, I saw something behind her, something that made my blood run cold. It was the old man, his face twisted in an expression of agony, his eyes empty, yet somehow filled with an unnatural light, a pale glow that seemed to come from within. He moved toward her, his limbs jerking unnaturally, as though he were a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The old woman's eyes widened in terror, her hand reaching out toward me, a silent plea for help that pierced through my fear. My heart pounded my chest, every instinct screaming for me to run, to leave this place and never look back, but I was rooted to the ground, unable to move. I watched as the old man drew closer to her, his body swaying as if caught in an unseen current, the glow in his eyes growing brighter, casting strange, flickering shadows across the garden. The realization hit me like a blow, a sudden, horrifying understanding of the truth that had been hidden in the whispers, in the shadows that had haunted this place. The old man hadn't been alone in his despair. He had been driven to it, haunted by the very same presence that now stood behind him, a darkness that had latched onto him, consumed him, and refused to let go. The whispers weren't just echoes of the past. They were the voice of something malevolent, something that had rooted itself in this place, feeding off the sorrow and despair that lingered here. The old woman's figure began to fade, her outline blurring as though she was being pulled back into the mist, her hands still reaching out, her eyes locked on mine. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break the hold that this darkness had over her. My gaze fell once again on the locket, and without thinking, I reached for it, my fingers closing around the cold metal. The moment I touched it, a surge of energy pulsed through me, a cold, electric shock that made my vision blur, the world spinning around me. I forced myself to my feet, the locket clutched tightly in my hand, and turned toward the figures in the mist. The old man had almost reached her, his movements slow and deliberate, his face contorted in pain. I took a step forward, my voice breaking the silence that had settled over the garden. "No," I shouted, my voice trembling, the word echoing in the stillness. The old woman's eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment, I saw something change, a spark of hope, a glimmer of recognition. The old man paused, his head turning toward me, the glow in his eyes flaring brighter, and I felt the weight of his gaze, the cold, consuming emptiness that lay within. It was like staring into an abyss, a darkness that promised to swallow me whole, and for a moment, I thought I would lose myself in it, that I would become just another part of this place, another lost soul bound to the garden. But the locket pulsed in my hand, a warmth spreading from it, pushing back against the cold, and I knew I had to act. I held the locket out in front of me, my hand shaking, and took another step forward. "You don't belong here," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the mist, cutting through the oppressive silence. The old man's form seemed to waver, the glow in his eyes flickering, and the old woman reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. The light in his eyes dimmed, and for a moment I saw his face change, the anguish softening, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. The mist began to recede, the figures fading along with it, and I felt the pressure in the air lift, the cold giving way to a gentle warmth. The old man turned, his gaze meeting the old woman's, and they began to dissolve into the mist, their forms intertwining, the glow fading until there was nothing left but the garden, silent and still. I stood there, the locket heavy in my hand, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps, and I knew that whatever darkness had held them here was gone, at least for now. But as I looked around the garden, at the shadows that still lingered, at the twisted branches of the old oak tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place would never truly be free, that the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, and that someday it might return. And as I turned to leave, the locket still clutched in my hand, I felt a chill run down my spine, a reminder that the line between our world and theirs was thin, and that the past never truly lets go. As I walked away from the garden, the locket held tightly in my hand, an eerie sense of calm washed over me. It was the kind of calm that follows a storm, a deceptive stillness that suggested the worst had passed but left behind an unmistakable tension, as though something unseen was still lurking just beyond my sight. I crossed the threshold of the iron gate, its rusted hinges letting out a metallic groan, and closed it firmly behind me, feeling the barrier between the garden and the rest of the world come down. Yet, despite the physical distance, I knew that something had changed within me, something that I couldn't leave behind so easily. The street was unnaturally quiet, the mist settling over the neighborhood like a shroud, and as I walked back toward home, I felt the weight of the experience pressing down on me. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was almost worse, a silence that seemed to follow me, hanging heavy in the air, reminding me that what I had seen, what I had faced, was far from ordinary. Every sound seemed amplified against that silence. The crunch of gravel under my feet, the distant rustling of leaves, the soft whisper of my own breath, and each one seemed to echo with an unnatural clarity, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The darkness I had encountered in that garden was gone, or at least, it seemed to be. But as I neared my house, I couldn't help but feel as though it had left its mark on me, that somehow, part of that supernatural presence had latched onto my very being. I paused at the edge of my yard, glancing back down the street, the silhouette of the elderly couple's house barely visible through the mist. For a moment, I thought I saw something there, a shadow moving just beyond the iron gate, a flicker of motion that made my heart skip a beat. I blinked, squinting through the fog, but there was nothing, just empty space, the garden hidden behind the veil of mist, silent and still. My mother greeted me at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. She didn't ask where I had been, and I didn't tell her. The truth was, even if I had tried to explain, I doubted she would have believed me. How could anyone understand what had happened in that garden? The darkness that had taken root there, the spirits that lingered just beyond the veil of our world. It felt like a story that didn't belong to this reality, a nightmare that had somehow crossed over into the waking world. I tried to push it out of my mind, to return to the normalcy of my life, but the memory of those hollow eyes, the whispers, the figure of the old man hanging from the tree, it all stayed with me, a ghost that refused to fade. That night, I lay in bed, the locket resting on my nightstand, and stared up at the ceiling, the darkness of my room pressing in on me. The quiet was absolute, the kind of quiet that felt almost unnatural, and I found myself straining to hear something, anything, that might break it. A whisper, a rustle of movement, a creak of the floorboards. But there was nothing, just silence, thick and suffocating. I turned over, my gaze falling on the locket, its tarnished surface catching the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through my curtains. It looked so ordinary now, so small and insignificant, and yet I knew the power it held, the darkness it had witnessed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. The old man's twisted expression, the old woman's hollow eyes, the way they had looked at each other in those final moments, their forms dissolving into the mist. It was as though the garden had left a scar on my mind, a permanent reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lay beyond it. And as I lay there, the darkness pressing in, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly gone, that some part of them still lingered, watching, waiting, bound to that place and now, perhaps, bound to me. In the days that followed, I tried to move on, to put the experience behind me. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible moments, when I felt it again. A chill in the air when there shouldn't have been, a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, a whisper that seemed to echo just beyond the edge of hearing. I would be walking down the street or sitting in my room, and suddenly, the world would shift, the colors fading, the air growing cold, and I would feel the weight of that presence again. It was never more than a moment, never long enough for me to be sure, but it was there, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than I had ever imagined. The garden at the end of the street remained empty, the gate closed, the house abandoned. No one went there anymore, and I couldn't bring myself to return, not even to glance down the street as I passed by. I knew that whatever darkness had taken root there had been quieted, at least for now, but I also knew that it wasn't truly gone. It was waiting, biding its time, and one day, perhaps, it would return. And when it did, I would be ready, or at least, I hoped I would be. In the end, the locket remained on my nightstand, a silent reminder of the encounter that had changed everything. It was a small, simple thing, and yet it carried with it the weight of all that had happened, a symbol of the line I had crossed, the darkness I had faced. And as I looked at it, day after day, I knew that my story with the garden, with the spirits that lingered there, was far from over. The shadows still moved, the whispers still called, and the fear that had once consumed me had transformed into something else, a determination, a readiness to face whatever waited in the darkness, to confront the unknown and see it for what it truly was. For in the end, the darkness may have taken root, but it hadn't won, not yet. And as long as I held the locket, as long as I remembered what I had seen, I knew that I could stand against it. The past may never truly let go, but neither would I. And so I waited, watched, and listened, knowing that one day, the darkness would return, and when it did, I would be ready to face it once again. Weeks passed, but the memory of that chilling encounter never faded. It lingered in the quiet moments, resurfacing when I least expected it, when the house creaked late at night, when the mist rolled in, shrouding the street in an unsettling gloom. It was as if that garden, with its decaying flowers and lifeless pond, had carved a place inside my mind. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, it was there, a constant, ghostly presence that whispered to me from the shadows. I could still feel the weight of the locket in my hand, the cold metal that seemed to pulse with an energy I could neither understand nor explain. It lay on my nightstand, a silent reminder of the encounter that had altered the fabric of my reality. Whenever I looked at it, I felt a chill, a sense of something watching, just out of sight, as if the connection between me and that dark place had never truly been severed. The line between our world and whatever existed in that garden was thin, frighteningly so, and I could feel it, an invisible thread binding me to that darkness. Life tried to return to normal, but I was no longer the same person who had walked into that garden. There was an edge to every day now, a sense that something was waiting just beyond the edge of perception. I started avoiding the end of the street where the old couple's house stood. Even from a distance, I could feel it, a presence that seemed to reach for me, trying to pull me back. The house remained abandoned, the windows dark and empty, but it was as if something was alive there, something that watched from behind the glass, something that knew I was still connected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a dull, bruised purple, I found myself standing at my bedroom window, staring at the distant silhouette of the garden. The mist was thick that night, curling around the trees like tendrils, creeping up the street, swallowing everything in its path. I couldn't look away, my eyes fixed on the spot where I knew the oak tree stood, hidden in the fog. My heart pounded, a slow, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo in the silence of the room, and as I watched, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow, a figure standing among the trees. The fear that had gripped me in that garden returned, a cold, creeping dread that spread through me like ice. I blinked, shaking my head, telling myself it was just the mist playing tricks, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, the weight of that gaze, the sense that something was there, waiting, watching. I turned away from the window, my eyes falling on the locket, and I hesitated. The air in the room seemed colder, the shadows longer, as if the darkness was reaching for me, trying to draw me back. I picked up the locket, its metal cold against my skin, and as I held it, I felt that connection again, a pull, a whisper that echoed just beyond the edge of hearing. It was a voice, soft and pleading, calling to me from somewhere far away. The old woman's face flashed in my mind, her hollow eyes, her outstretched hand, and I knew that whatever had happened in that garden wasn't over. The spirits that lingered there were still trapped, bound to that place, and somehow I was bound to them. The whispers grew louder in my mind, filling the silence, and I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, trying to shut out the cold, the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. But the voices wouldn't stop. They called to me, not with anger or malice, but with sorrow, with a deep, aching despair that made my chest tighten. They were lost, trapped between this world and the next, and somehow I had become part of their story. I could feel their pain, their longing, and it terrified me. Suddenly, I felt a pressure on my shoulder, like a hand pressing down, and my eyes snapped open, a gasp escaping my lips. The room was empty, the shadows still, the mist swirling outside the window, but the feeling remained, a sense that I was not alone. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the faint glow of the streetlight casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The locket felt heavier now, almost as if it was weighing me down, pulling me back toward the darkness that lay in that garden. I knew I couldn't keep it. The locket was a tether, a link to the spirits that had haunted that place, and as long as I held onto it, I would never be free. The whispers would never stop. The shadows would never fade. I had to return it, to bring it back to where it belonged, to sever the connection once and for all. But the thought of going back filled me with dread. I had faced that darkness once, had stood in the presence of something beyond my understanding, and I wasn't sure if I could do it again. But I also knew that I had no choice. The darkness was part of me now, and until I faced it, until I returned the locket to its rightful place, I would never be free. The spirits that lingered in that garden were waiting, their voices echoing in my mind, a constant reminder that the past never truly lets go, that the line between our world and the next is thin, and sometimes it takes more than courage to cross it. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the locket, and made a silent promise to myself. I would return. I would face whatever waited in that garden, whatever watched from the shadows. I would bring the locket back, and I would end it, once and for all. The past might never let go, but I would not be its prisoner. I would confront the darkness, and maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to bring peace to those spirits, and to myself. And so I waited, watching the mist swirl outside my window, listening to the whispers that filled the silence, knowing that the time would come when I would have to return to that place, to the garden where the living and the dead converged, and face whatever lay beyond the veil. The fear remained, a constant, chilling presence, but so did the determination. I had seen the darkness, had faced it, and I would face it again, no matter what it took. The past may have its shadows, but I would not let them define me.